It's another business week. Welcome to Business Morning and thank you for joining us. I am Bisi Adebayo. Oil prices have plunged to a historic low after OPEC's failure to strike a deal with its allies regarding production cuts caused Saudi Arabia to slash its prices as it reportedly gets set to ramp up production, and that led to fears of an all-out price war. As at this morning now, Brent crude futures plummeted to 27.26% at $32.93 a barrel, while U.S. crude dropped 29.48% to $29.11 a barrel. On Saturday, Saudi Arabia announced massive discounts to its official selling prices for April, and the nation is reportedly preparing to increase its production above 10 million barrels per day mark. The kingdom currently pumps 9.7 million barrels per day, but has the capacity to ramp up to 12.5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's price cut followed a breakdown of talks in Vienna last week. On Thursday, OPEC recommended an additional production cut of 1.5 million barrels per day starting in April and extending until the end of the year. But OPEC's ally, Russia, rejected the additional cuts when the 14-member group and its allies known as OPEC Plus met on Friday. The meeting also concluded with no directive about the production cuts that are currently in place but set to expire at the end of the month. Now, this effectively means that nations will soon have free rein over how much they pump. Goldman Sachs also cut its second and third quarter Brent forecast to $30 per barrel and said that prices could dip into the $20 range. And in all of this, however, OPEC Secretary General Mohammed Barkindo remains optimistic on the oil markets. The Nigerian Minister of Finance also said on Wednesday that the government was worried about the drop in oil revenue and will soon begin a midterm review of the budget to determine the way forward. Well, here on Business Morning, we will continue to follow up on this and keep you posted. Meantime, yesterday, March the 8th, the International Women's Day was marked all over the world, celebrating the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women with the 2020 campaign theme #equal or each for equal rather. The women are saying that let's build a gender equal world. Equality, they say, is not a women's issue but a business issue. But gender equality is essential for economies and communities to thrive, and the race is on for the gender equal boardroom, a gender equal government, a gender equal media coverage, gender equal workplaces, equal sports coverage, more gender equality in health and wealth. Well, let's kick off this conversation with Titilayo Ola, who is an investment analyst with AfriInvest Securities. Good morning and thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
I guess it's not too late to wish ourselves Happy Women's Day, right?
Sure. Happy International Women's Day.
Good. So how can, or is it even possible to achieve a gender equal world?
Well, yes, it's possible, but I mean, a lot of work has to be done and a lot of things would have to change, because when we look at gender equality, it basically entails equal access to rights and opportunities irrespective of the gender. So we are looking at access to social, political and economic opportunities. But when we look inwards critically, not just as a country, but I mean globally, we see that we still have a lot of things to do in terms of gender inequality because it is still very prevalent. And that is why days such as International Women's Day is very important to be celebrated, because while on one hand we're highlighting and celebrating the feats and successes that women have achieved over time, we are also on the other hand trying to highlight the challenges and issues that women are facing on a daily basis due to gender inequality. So yes, it is possible to achieve this, but looking at this year's theme, for instance, Each for Equal, it basically focuses on collective individualism. I mean, we're all part of a whole, and our individual actions would tell on the larger society, and so we all have to stand for equality. So it starts with the individuals before we then go large scale to the government. So as individuals, we also have to stand for equality. We have to eradicate the biases that we have towards women in the workplace. There's still the gender pay gap, there's still gender-based violence and all of that. And so on the government hand as well, we also need to enact like policies and legislations that would have to support women all around the world as well.
What about economic growth now? How does gender equality affect economic growth?
Well, I think firstly it's important to note that the huge cost of depriving women and girls access to rights and opportunities are not just borne by the women and girls, but are by economies and societies as at large. And so it's no longer a woman's problem. It's actually a business and economic problem, because when we look at the population, for instance, when we deprive women and girls of access to basic rights and opportunities, we are reducing their welfare, we are reducing their capacity to directly produce and, of course, impact the economy as a whole. And so it's actually a big problem. When we look at the study conducted by the World Bank and the Canadian government, for example, it shows that women control just about 32% of human capital wealth globally, and while men control, of course, 68% of that. And, of course, there's been huge losses to human capital wealth globally. It's been estimated to be about $160 trillion, which is, I mean, almost double the global GDP. And on per capita basis, the loss is about $23,000 per person. And so this is huge. And it makes sense because when we look at Nigeria, for instance, the National Population Commission estimates that we were 199 million as at 2017, and a further breakdown of this population shows that the ratios of men to women are actually very close. So for every 103 males, we have 100 females. And so while you are empowering a gender at the expense of the other gender, there will be economic issues and there will be economic consequences. And so, of course, it tells on us as a country and is reducing our output, collective output as a country, because women are not being given equal rights and opportunities to their basic rights, basically.
But how would you rate women's contribution to economic development here in Nigeria?
Well, I would say women are not being given, of course, enough opportunities. And it's not just in terms of economic and business opportunities. So it has to be throughout the life cycle. We start from education, early childhood education, for example, access to primary education. We know that 130 million girls are out of school. Between the ages of 6 and 17, 130 million girls are out of school. We look at the primary enrollment, 58% of girls go to primary school, and then that drops to 47% in secondary school. And, of course, about 8% attend universities. And so it has to be throughout the life cycle. We have to give them the basic education that they need to be, productive for themselves and for the economy as a whole. And so it's throughout the life cycle, like I said. So we're not doing so well. We see that in the rural areas, for instance, women are more, they participate more in, like, the meager occupation, so farming, and this is not, of course, directly contributing per se to the economy, because they farm, to feed themselves and their family. And so we haven't seen a good representation of women in economic activities.
But how about the roles of women in this? Are they actually bringing themselves out enough to show that we can actually do this?
Yes, I think we've seen an improvement in that. But, of course, we also have to look at the restrictive social norms in the society. This is restricting women from, of course, vying for political offices, for instance. There's this unconscious bias that we have towards women that, oh, no, you can't do this or you can't do that. In terms of occupation stereotypes as well, you can't go into this occupation, you can't do this and that. And so that, of course, affects the mindset and mentality of females. But in the economic aspects, of course, we're seeing improvements in women coming out, of course, to do better things. So I think in terms of the economic aspects, we've seen that. But the norms are also kind of restricting women from coming out more.
Okay, let's talk about the corporate environment now. How would you assess the level of women leaders in corporate environments? Looking at quoted companies, for instance, now, the statistics of women, what would you say about the statistics of women in the boardroom?
Well, of course, there's a misrepresentation of women in the boardroom. It's quite obvious. We haven't seen enough women, particularly on quoted companies, like you said, although we've seen recent appointments by companies, so Transcorp Hotels, Transcorp Group, for instance, Nestle, Access Bank, First Bank, and the likes. They have women on their boards, which is also good. But, of course, we still have room for improvement. For instance, there was a 2016 survey that showed that between 2013 to 2015, the number of women on the board, the percentage of women on the boards of quoted companies was about 14%, which is very, very small. So there's still that gender gap. So while we acknowledge that, there's been increased sensitization and more companies are actually appointing women on the boards of quoted companies, we still also have a long way to go. And I think it has to do with also mentoring ladies and women to, to prepare them for roles in leadership positions as well.
What about the role of the family? Because many would argue that it may be difficult for a woman to balance family and, of course, being in a leadership role together. So how do you think this can be balanced?
Well, of course, it's important to also know that as women, there are different stages of life, and we also have to balance this. So I think it has to do with the workplace and understanding this. So we know that women are, of course, going to get married at some point and have babies at some point. And so there has to be enough support to, to women in the workplace to ensure that, I mean, in terms of maternity leave, they are well taken care of. They are given enough time, to take care of their family and then get back to work. But I think in terms of the corporate environment in Nigeria, this is actually getting better. But in terms of balancing the workplace and, of course, family, I think women are actually handling this better, but it also has to do with the support that they get from their organizations and the workplace.
Well, let's talk about the Global Gender Gap Report 2020, which was released by the World Economic Forum. It places Nigeria at 128th position out of 153 countries in closing the gender gap. What does this tell us?
Of course, a scorecard of 128 out of 153 isn't great at all. So the World Economic Forum Gender Global Report basically focuses on 4 key indices in measuring gender equality. So, of course, on the social aspect, we have health and survival, we have education attainment, and then we have political empowerment and access to economic opportunities. Although it's not all doom and gloom, because in terms of economic access to economic opportunities, we are ranked 38 globally. Of course, this measures access to opportunities in the workplace, the percentage of women in the workplace, the gender pay gap, and the likes. So we are doing okay in that aspect. But when it comes to the social aspect, we are performing very poorly. Like I mentioned, for education, for instance, 130 million girls are out of school in Nigeria. We have very low enrollment rates across both secondary, primary, and tertiary institutions. In terms of the health and survival, of course, we see increased gender-based violence in the country as well. And the maternal mortality rates are, of course, soaring higher. We don't have enough access to health care and all of that. And so this is telling on us as a country. In terms of political empowerment as well, we have like a long way to go. Currently, the percentage of women in the ministerial cabinet is less than 20%. And so that tells us that we actually have a lot of work to do. And so we were ranked 128 of 153 countries globally. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, we were ranked 27 out of 34 countries, which is very, very poor. And it just tells us that we have a long way to go. For instance, the gender equality and giving access to women and girls is the 5th sustainable development goals, because it is very important to governments and individuals, to work on this. And so as a country, we actually need to enact policies, like I said, consistent policies and legislations that would, improve this access to rights and opportunities.
Titilayo Ola, investment analyst with Afrinvest Securities. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Right. Meanwhile, the Nigerian Stock Exchange joined some 78 other exchanges around the world to observe the Women's Day on Friday, with some top female executives of listed and non-listed listed companies, rather. Well, the event birthed the 3-year program between the NSE and the International Finance Corporation. And my colleague Temple Ashaju had a chat with the country manager of the IFC, Ms. Emerson Lori, who explains the objective of this initiative and gives an insight into the theme for the 2020 International Women's Day, tagged Each for Equal. Stay with us.
International Women's Day is for all of us. We all must equally be behind the cause of women's empowerment, women business, women in the labor force. So it's really for all of us. This theme this year, Each for Equal, is important because it aims to highlight the opportunities where we can find and see equality for women. A couple things to keep in mind. This is a journey, and one thing we have to acknowledge is that this is not something that's going to happen overnight, but we do need to see a lot more progress. Recently, the World Economic Forum produced a report, the gender report, that said that given the current progress, we're not going to see equality or parity for another century with respect to women in the workforce, women in leadership. Now, that is a very daunting statistic, and it's something that we have to do something about. And the only way to do that is if we really push and we're much more deliberate. So I think the opportunity of the theme this year is for us to think about how we can be more deliberate. in the Nigerian context, it's also very important. The IMF produced a report recently that said that if Nigeria addressed its gender gaps, Nigeria could increase GDP by 1.5%. 1.5%. Now that is huge when you think about where GDP is today in Nigeria. Just addressing gender gaps could actually almost double GDP. So for us, there's a clear business case, and this year presents an opportunity to highlight some of the particular areas where we can see more equality for women.
So how would you describe the federal government's efforts towards this gender balance or gender parity discourse? Again, bearing in mind that the central bank is now doing a lot to provide access to credit for women.
So yeah, I mean, the progress hasn't been as fast as we would like to have seen it. And I think the fact that the goals for financial inclusion in Nigeria have been revised in the recognition that more needs to be done is an acknowledgement that not enough has been done. But I think going forward, what I'd like to see is, and actually this is already happening, I think in the past, gender topics and conversations about women in the workplace were oftentimes there wasn't really a kind of support behind it. Now what we're seeing are banking institutions, fast-moving consumer good institutions who are very serious and very deliberate about what they want to do in terms of getting more female clients, getting more female distributors, more women entrepreneurs, more women suppliers and distributors, the whole ecosystem of where women can play a role in business. They're much more serious about it. Many of the banks are taking on programs to enhance and accelerate lending to women. Again, FMCG companies are focusing on how to bring more women into their distribution chain. So the efforts now are much more deliberate. They're doing the research to figure out where there are gender gaps, and then they're putting the programs in place. So what we do as an institution, both in Nigeria and globally, is to help institutions that are really genuine about trying to move this agenda forward, helping them to achieve those objectives.
Do you think formalizing the informal sector will create a difference?
That is a great question. I'd probably say yes and no. It's a complicated one. If you think about the informal sector in Nigeria, now Nigeria, I think across Africa has the largest informal sector, relatively speaking. So it's a big country with a massive informal sector. And in that informal sector, what we find is that many, if not most, of the enterprises there are run by and owned by women. So that's where women entrepreneurship really shows up in the informal sector. And so I think that there are very creative ways in which we can activate the informal sector to provide some of the gains that we'd like to see in the formal sector. So the concept of formalizing can be looked at, I think, in different ways. Certainly that's the trend we'd like to see. You need to see more formalization, there's no question about that. But I think the way in which we do it can be much more creative and thoughtful. It's not just about taxes. Taxes are important, but it's not just about that. Informal business has to have a lot of reason to formalize so that they see the benefits of that. And so there must be this entire ecosystem focused on what are all those benefits that an informal company can see by becoming formal. And I think that's when we think about the entire picture, then it becomes very interesting to think about how we push more formalization. But focusing on one thing, I think, is not going to do it.
Now, talk to us about your collaboration with the Nigerian Stock Exchange.
We're very excited about this collaboration. We are going to embark on a 3-year program with the NSC and we're calling it Nigeria to Equal. Nigeria to Equal. So what we're trying to do here is really highlight the opportunity of the business case of women in business, women in management, women entrepreneurship, women as clients, all of these things all together. Now, what we're hearing again and again from many stakeholders is that there's a data gap. So we know that there is a strong business case, and we will continue to try and articulate that business case so more and more businesses understand it. But we're convinced that most people know that there is a business case for this, but there's still some data gaps. So this partnership will help us identify what those data gaps are, to understand what the gender gaps are, and that will help companies then create programs that could then accelerate women in their ecosystem. So the NSC is well positioned to be a voice for this, to engage with the private sector on this, to help. It has a great convening power, so to bring organizations together. So this partnership hopefully will help address some of the data issues that we see. also will help build what we see as important peer-to-peer learning. So companies learning from each other. One company has seen great progress in a particular initiative. Why not share some elements of that without sharing all of their great secrets? Why not share some elements of that with other companies so that the entire ecosystem will benefit?